Welcome to Chautauqua People. My guest today is Gary Moore. He grew up on a ranch in the hill country of central Texas, where he decided to become an agriculture teacher. He did his undergraduate work at Tarleton State University, taught high school agriculture in Ohio, and completed his master's and PhD from Ohio State. He subsequently taught at Purdue University in Indiana, which he found to be too cold, Louisiana State University in Louisiana, which he found to be too hot, and North Carolina State University, which he found to be just right, from 1989 until his retirement in 2017. He received many recognitions, composing a list too long for this program. At one time or another, he has served as president of 4 different professional organizations. He's made presentations annually at Chautauqua from 2011 as part of the Chautauqua Heritage Lecture Series. The focus of his work has been on the major themes of American rural life during past century. He nearly always speaks to a full house, from his first, The History and Evolution of the Outhouse, to this year's Meeting to Pray and Play, and sometimes Sway, the camp meeting story. Gary, how did you make your way to Chautauqua?
Well, there's 2 paths I took. When I prepare people to be agriculture teachers, we talk about the history of adult education, and Chautauqua pops up. And then Dr. Missy Baker, a longtime Chautauquan who comes every year, recommended me to the archivist, said, "You need to have Gary Moore come speak." And he just took her for her word and invited me up to speak. So.
And that's 2011,
right.
And you've been coming every year since.
Right. In 2011, the theme for the week was World Hunger. No, it was World Health. I'm sorry, World Health. And I was speaking on outhouses.
So what did you learn about them? What can you tell us?
Well, they're pretty important to have out in the rural areas. When I gave my presentation, I have clickers that are electronic, and I ask people questions. And one of the questions I ask is how many people in America are currently using outhouses? And according to the latest census, is 1.6 million. People in Alaska, 12% of the people in Alaska use outhouses, and you'll find them all over the country. But how this ties into what I do in agricultural education is during the Depression, there were a number of programs started by the government to help rural people. There was the Soil Conservation Service Act, Rural Electrification Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act. Then there was an act called the Workers' Progress Administration. It was an agency, and they went around building outhouses to improve sanitation throughout America. And by the end of the time, they had built over 2 million outhouses.
Goodness.
They were sanitary. A lot of the outhouses in the South were pretty unsanitary. So those are some of the things that we've learned about outhouses. If you were really educated, when you would go to the outhouse and you had company, you would not say, "I am going to the outhouse." You would say, "I'm going to go visit Miss Perkins."
Miss Perkins.
Miss Perkins, because there was a female Secretary of Labor, and her name was Miss Perkins. And she was over the outhouse building program. And then the thing that I get asked the most about outhouses is why you have 2-holers. Now, why would you have a 2-hole outhouse? And in my quiz that I give, I say, is it for a husband and wife to talk with each other? Is it to get the farm hands in and out quicker? Or is it for parents and children? And the correct answer is parents and children. One hole is supposed to be bigger than the other hole. And the younger children sit on the smaller hole because there's always a fear that a child could sit in the bigger hole and fall through.
Okay, so they were differently sized.
That's right.
And when Chautauqua Institution was built, it was built with outhouses, was it not?
Yes, it was.
And then it was a major deal when they made the change for the sewerage.
And at one time in the hotel, they had chamber pots. So if you look at the evolution of outhouses in the Bible in Deuteronomy, it talks about having a spear with a paddle on one end. And you would dig a hole with the paddle so your enemies didn't know you were in their territory. So we went from paddles to pots,
Pots.
and then to privies.
Privies.
Right. So,
PPP.
yeah, in some places they call them privies. Here in America we call them outhouses.
Got it. Now, what's the big date for an outhouse in the annual calendar?
What do you mean? Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, one of the questions I ask is, what is the worst time of the year to be in an outhouse? And I have several choices, and the correct answer is October the 31st, because a prank was often to go tip over the outhouse. And so October the 31st is not the night you want to be in the outhouse. It could get tipped over.
That could be trouble. Now, where do they still have large numbers of outhouses in the States today?
In the United States, you'll find several different pockets of outhouses. A lot of them are on Indian reservations, and a lot are down south where we have migrant laborers. On the Texas-Mexico border, there's a number of outhouses. The state that has the most outhouses in total is California. In my state of North Carolina, we're fifth, but there's still a lot of outhouses in existence.
Is the government still counting outhouses?
They were in the annual census. However, recently, because they wanted to be more politically correct, they no longer ask about indoor plumbing.
Okay. That's just assumed that is universal.
Right.
And that settles that. So let's talk about your current program. Can you share some of that with me? Current lecture that you're going to be doing this week at Chautauqua?
Yes, it's going to be about the camp meeting. And basically, the old camp meetings were outdoor revivals. And they occurred in the western part of the country. And the western part of the country in the 1800s was Kentucky, Tennessee, western North Carolina. But in the year 1800, 95% of the population lived in areas of less than 2,500 people.
Really?
Yes. And Philadelphia only had 43,000 in that year. So what happens if you wanted to reach the people who needed to be reached, you would go out in the rural areas, because as settlers moved west, they would first build a cabin, then they'd build a barn, and then eventually, when enough people were there, they would build a church.
Got it.
So prior to churches being built, there were circuit riding preachers that would go around and they would hold outdoor church services. And some of the outdoor church services would attract 1,000 or 2,000 people. And one of the hallmarks of some of these outdoor meetings was a chance to participate in the Lord's Supper, because you didn't do it every day or every week or every month in church. So it was a rare occasion. So if you were a devout Christian and wanted to honor the Lord's Supper, they would happen at the camp meetings.
How did that go about that?
Well, it was different for different religious groups. The Presbyterians were pretty active in early camp meetings, but they didn't want just anybody to take the Lord's Supper, because a lot of people would show up at camp meetings and some weren't very religious. So before they had the Lord's Supper, you had to meet with the church leaders, and you had to show that you'd led a worthy life and that you were a good practicing Christian, and then they would give you a token.
Can we get a good look close up of the token here?
And there were some tokens that were circular, and then there were some that were oblong, and then there were some that were like stars. And so you had to have a token to participate in the Lord's Supper. So you'd show up for the Lord's Supper, then you'd present your token, which meant you were worthy of participating in the Lord's Supper.
And I assume these were then served with a rail, with a chalice, and old school.
Yes, there's hundreds of different styles of tokens, and many do have a chalice on the back, and nearly all have a Bible verse.
Got it.
Right.
And when did this cease to be the practice?
This was in the early 1800s.
The 1800s.
Right. One of the most famous camp meetings occurred at Cane Ridge, in Kentucky, there were between 10 and 30,000 people in attendance. It made the news across Europe, and people would come just to see what was going on. And they had communion at that service.
Now, where is Cane Ridge? I've never heard of it.
Cane Ridge is a small church outside of Paris, which is outside of Lexington.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was a church established in 1791.
Goodness.
And whenever you study the history of camp meetings, there's always a mention of Cane Ridge.
Right.
And there's even books about Cane Ridge, the Great Revival. In different eras of religion, we have one called the Second Great Awakening, and it started around 1800 at Cane Ridge. But there were camp meetings prior to that.
And then this was the largest one. And when did these meetings sort of fade?
Well, they were very popular until the late 1830s, 1840s.
Okay.
And then they started to decline, and there were three reasons they declined. One is the Presbyterians left.
Okay.
They didn't do camp meetings anymore because Presbyterians were wanting to have a very solemn service. And you get out here and there was a lot of shrieking and hollering, and people would roll on the ground, and when they were convicted by the Spirit, they were slain and they would fall on the ground. So they thought that was too much hysterics.
Right.
And then the second reason is as the West got settled, there were churches actually being built, so we didn't need them. And the main driving force behind all of these camp meetings was the Methodist Bishop Francis Asbury.
Okay.
And after he passed away, the next set of bishops weren't quite as wild over camp meetings. Asbury said a camp meeting was like fishing with a big net.
Right.
Because there were a lot of unsaved people there that needed to be saved.
Now, when Asbury came to the States, he came from Britain?
Yes, he was born in England, and John Wesley asked for volunteers to come to America, and so he came to America.
Wesley set up those chapels often along the coast of Britain. And when Asbury got to the States, how many Methodists were there?
About 1,400. And
when he passed away, how many?
214,000. It was tremendous growth. And a lot of it occurred on the western frontier with the circuit riding preachers.
Got it. And so they became a big part of it, didn't they?
Yes.
Now, when they had these campground activities, do they have pastors of more than one denomination participate?
Yes. What happens when you have 20,000 people or 10,000 or even 5,000 people? How are you going to, without a public address system, address these many people? So what they would do, they would erect what they call a preaching stand, which was an elevated platform, and they might have one in this location and one on the opposite end and one out this way. So you would have maybe 3 or 4 different preachers at the same time. And the Presbyterian preachers were highly educated. They'd been to the seminary. And so they would preach, but also they would involve Baptist and Methodist. And so you might have Baptist and Methodist preaching also. So you would have a number of different preachers preaching at the same time.
Simultaneously.
Yeah.
So you go and listen to the one you like, and
yes.
that's it.
Yeah, and there are recorded instances of some young children, like 12 years old, that felt they should be preaching, so they would get up on a tree stump and start preaching away.
Goodness.
And sometimes they would attract more people than the others. There's a story of a 12-year-old boy who reached into his pocket, pulled out a white handkerchief, and said, as he dropped it, if you're a sinner, this is like what's going to happen to you. So he was pretty effective. Some of the Presbyterian ministers, they were highly educated, so they would deliver sermons that were very sound, very theologically great, but they might go over the heads of the commoners out there.
So they didn't connect with the people that well.
Right, and the Methodists, they connected better, and the Baptists were often bivocational. They might be farmers or blacksmith during the week, then they would preach on the weekends. So they really could connect with the people.
So they were of the community then.
Right.
Okay, so this was a significant part of the United States. How do we relate that to the Chautauqua movement?
Well, what happens, camp meetings declined in the 40s. Then we had the Civil War. And then after the Civil War was over, we had a resurgence of camp meetings.
Really?
Yeah, and there were, in the South, a number of African American camp meetings established. In the early days, the people would bring their slaves to camp meetings to take care of them. But then after they were freed, then they said, oh, let's have camp meetings. So there were a lot of black camp meetings, and there was the holiness movement, so they established camp meetings. But then there were a number of people that said we need to change the focus or direction. Many people are religious already. So Chautauqua was established on a Methodist camp meeting ground.
Got it.
And the two gentlemen who established Chautauqua were Methodist, and they wanted to have a school for Sunday school teachers. So that's what they established. One of the first persons that attended Chautauqua in 1874 was a Methodist holiness minister. And he said, this is a perversion because there's not enough religion being taught.
Oh, goodness.
The next year, a gentleman showed up with some songbooks and led an impromptu song singing, and Bishop Vincent ran him off because it was not authorized.
Goodness.
So the people who looked at camp meetings as hellfire and brimstone and repent, they weren't real sure about the change in direction that occurred in the 1860s and 70s.
Okay. And then it was pretty well established. So we speak about 1874, I guess, is the founding year for Chautauqua.
Right.
And that got standardized at the time. Okay. Now, you made a stop en route at a camp facility.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? And I hope we can sort of tie that to the larger movement.
Okay. Well, I have visited 5 camp meeting sites in South Carolina and 5 in North Carolina. But coming up here, the ones in North Carolina and South Carolina are very primitive.
Okay.
And I'd always heard about Ocean Grove in New Jersey.
Okay.
So on the way up here, I sort of swung by there. They have a tabernacle that seats 7,000 people.
Whoa.
And they have around the tabernacle 114 tents that people stay in, because that's the way they did it early on.
Whoa.
And then they have some fantastic mansions, and it looks a whole lot like Chautauqua.
Really?
Except it's flat and there's the ocean at the edge.
As opposed to a lake.
Right. Yeah, there's a big ocean there. Mm-hmm. And what happens, they decided this was going to be a holiness camp, and you go there to try to become more perfect and a closer walk with God. But also they recognized recreation, enjoying life, sitting out, peaceful, relaxful. So it was a combination of the camp meeting, and then it was somewhat like Chautauqua.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. And you didn't went to one in Pennsylvania, did you not?
Yes.
What was that like?
I went to Dimmock Methodist Campground in Pennsylvania. It was started in 1877, and at one time it was on a railroad line, and people would stop and get off the railroad. Mm-hmm. And there were over 100 cottages, and they had a preacher stand, and under the preacher stand they actually had a jail, so if you acted up you'd get thrown into jail.
Oh my goodness.
And it was fantastic, but over time it's down to 23 cottages now, and it's a small group. So you'll find across the United States, if I were to guess, I would guess there's probably 300 camp meetings that are still in operation.
Right.
And some are more like Chautauqua, Martha's Vineyard, Ocean Grove, and then some are pretty small.
Right.
And a number have gone out over the last 50 years. They no longer exist.
That's the end of them, yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, when I look at your material, I was just astounded at the number of very fine presentations you've done. One caught my eye, the Rosenwald schools. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Okay. In the early 1900s, in the South, the schools that black children attended were substandard. They were old, run-down buildings. They'd often been a school for white children, And then after they got decrepit, the white children went to another school and the black children went there. They had hand-me-down books, hand-me-down desks, and it was very deplorable. And a gentleman by the name of Julius Rosenwald, who is president of Sears and Roebuck, became interested in the plight of the black people in the South because he was a good friend with Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
And Booker T. Washington encouraged him to enter into a school building program. So Rosenwald started putting up money to build rural schools in the South for black children. And during the life of that program, over 5,000 elementary schools were built in the South for black children. There was a very standard set of blueprints that you had to follow. It was very modernistic, up to date, and some of the white schools started using the blueprints for their schools. And a lot of famous people have attended these Rosenwald schools. At one time, 1 out of every 3 children in the South who was black attended a Rosenwald school.
Wow.
Maya Angelou attended a Rosenwald school.
Goodness, goodness. Are many of them still in existence?
There are a number in existence. Many have been converted into community centers.
Right.
Or something similar to that, a historical type of museum. So if you go into a county where there may have been 24 at one time, there may be 4 left.
Just a few.
Right, but they were absorbed into the school system of the county back in the 50s and 60s.
Right. So they've been modernized or probably reduced.
Right, yeah.
And go on. Now, I've got a million topics I want to talk with you about, but as an NC State alumnus from a department that had some connection to agriculture, the School of Agriculture, tell me a little bit about graduate training, and you supervise many dissertations, methinks.
Right.
What kind of advice would you tell us about the process, and what kind of advice would you give, let's say, to a Chautauqua college student who wanted to go to graduate school?
Okay, the first thing I would say is look carefully at the job market on the other end.
Right.
A PhD is good, it makes you a broader person, it's educational, but you sort of got to consider the job market. I took a course once when I was in graduate school taught by our dean, and I asked him what's the average salary for a new PhD. He said what the market will bear. And he said if you have an opening for an English faculty member, you'll have 300 applicants. If you have an opening for somebody in agriculture, you might have 10 or 12. Because a lot of people think agriculture is a dying industry, so why would I go into that? There's a study done every 5 years by the USDA looks at the job markets, and there's a tremendous job market for people with training in agriculture. So I'd say, well, look at the job market first, and then the second, look at your reason for wanting to get a PhD. I had a guy once says, man, I am doing a terrible job of teaching, I hate it, so I'm going to get a doctorate. Well, that's not the right reason.
Yeah.
No, the right reason should be to help other people and move the field forward.
Do you have any somebody who wants a degree in agriculture, and as I come and talk to you, Chautauquan, do you have any specific advice, courses, or activities or the like?
Well, what I do when I meet with a student who wants to go into graduate school, we discuss, why do you want to do this? And then I explain what our department does. And a lot of people don't understand what agricultural education is. And it's a field where we teach people how to educate others about agriculture. And after they understand that, if that's the direction they want to go, then we sit down and they form a graduate committee. There's 3 people from our department on it, plus an outside person, which is going to be in their minor area. We sit down and look at all the courses we offer, and then they pick which courses they want to take, and it's their degree program. We have a few requirements, but after that, they take the courses they want. We have some students interested in international development, so we pick courses that fit into that. We have some that want to go into distance education, so we pick courses that do that. And then they take these courses, and at the end they have a 16-hour written comprehensive exam followed by an oral exam. And they have to demonstrate mastery of the field and that they can apply what they've taught. It's not just regurgitate a bunch of facts.
Yeah.
So they have to be able to apply the knowledge they have gained. And that's hard for some people.
I remember those exams, and they were done well. We had an oral exam afterward, and then tell us about the dissertation process.
Okay. You have to do original research, and we encourage students to pick something. You're going to have to do it to pick a significant problem and then do research on that significant problem. And a lot of the students that I have advised will do research dealing with distance education, because more and more universities are moving into distance education.
Right.
So what is the best way to do distance education? How do we make it sound? There are some people that think distance education is inferior to real education. I've seen some professors, the students can only learn when they sit in my classroom, and I'll go watch them teach, and their teaching is terrible. So you can have good distance education. So,
Right.
so a lot of my students have studied that. We also look at instructional technologies.
Right. And how long is the dissertation process normally?
Well, I tell a student, if you're smart, you'll work on it from day one. So when you have class assignments, you do class assignments that you think will sort of fit into your review of literature and where you're headed. But typically a doctoral program is 3 to 4 years. And generally the last 1/3 of it is writing your dissertation.
Right. Right. I had similar advice, and the point was, when you write papers, write them toward your dissertation topic.
Right.
So you have approached it from many different angles. And the observation I was given was that we see some students who come to the point of comprehensive exams and haven't narrowed the dissertation topic, and many of them never get past the hurdle
Right.
and finish, and that is heartbreaking to see.
I went to a university once and looked in their graduate catalog where they listed all the faculty, and they had several faculty listed with, after their name, ABD, and I'd never heard of an ABD degree. So I inquired, what is an ABD degree? All but dissertation. And it's not a degree, but it says they've done graduate work, but they haven't written a dissertation. So I found that to be amusing.
Right, and maybe that's somebody you would say who's an instructor who's come out, and you give them a few years to get it finished, and that's it. How many doctoral programs have you supervised?
Probably 30 during my career.
Goodness, goodness.
And most of them have been females, because I encourage diversity in the field of agriculture. And a number have been African Americans, and some have actually been from Africa. And I've had several students have gone back and become university presidents in Africa. So that makes me feel good.
It must be immensely satisfying.
Yes.
Immensely satisfying. Can you believe it? We're out of time. Do you have anything else we need to discuss?
Well, normally when I teach graduate classes,
Right.
they are 3 hours in length, because we hold them in the evening so people can work during the day. So if we have 2 more hours, 2.5 hours.
2.5 hours.
Well,
We're just getting on a roll.
Yeah, we can talk about a lot of things.
I took a few of those classes at night, and
Sure.
they were tough.
Yes.
They were tough. Well, this has been fun, and I hope you'll come back. My guest has been Gary Moore from North Carolina State University, and this is Chautauqua People.